Staying with that story, a retired professor of international law at Unisa, André Thomashausen, is questioning the timing of Zelensky's visit to South Africa. He believes this could further worsen Pretoria's already frosty relations with the United States. Professor Thomashausen joins us now for more. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. I want to start with the question that a lot of people have been asking. What it is that President Cyril Ramaphosa has that will put him in a pole position to be able to bring these warring countries together. What is it that he has?
Well, definitely he tried right at the beginning. We will remember, together with, if I remember correctly, 5 other heads of state from Africa. He visited Kiev in the Ukraine, and he also visited Russia. And he tried to stress the point that South Africa had a peaceful transition and that South Africa's constitution uniquely respects all national languages. We have 11 of them written into the constitution, and that we do follow the European post-war model that was actually enshrined in a very important convention, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. But it was a bad timing. The conflict had just started. Russia was convinced that the conflict wouldn't take very long to bring about a decisive result. There were negotiations, as we remember, in March in Turkey. There was a draft agreement, but the European Union intervened and encouraged Ukraine to continue with a very, very strong and very brave, but limited military defense. And now we have a different situation. It is what in the academic world we call the ripeness of the conflict. The ripeness of the conflict is attained when it is more painful for the parties in the conflict to continue than to settle. So I think the conditions for a settlement are better now. Whether it is South Africa's turn to suddenly take lead, where America is actually in charge of negotiations, intense negotiations with Russia, and where America has boycotted a meeting yesterday in London, where President Zelensky tried to once again put his ideas of restoring the complete territorial integrity of the Ukraine on the table. So it is a minefield, but probably there is a good reason why President Zelensky chose to pick up where he didn't engage over 2 years ago.
Well, President Ramaphosa and President Putin had a conversation on Monday, after which the Kremlin issued a statement insisting that any peace talks must respect Russia's security interest, and that for them is the condition for any peace talks. And on the other hand, something you just alluded to, you have Ukraine talking about its territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Russia, of course, will not have sacrificed that many lives. According to the Ukrainian figure, they sacrificed about 700,000. According to Russian figures, maybe 1/10 of that. Be it what it may, the sacrifice has been enormous on both sides, and probably this conflict has so far cost 1 million lives. So it is time, as President Trump very rightly says, that a conflict that should never have started will finally end. And from my comparative constitutional perspective, we have lots of language and ethnic minorities in Europe. The whole of Europe is a tapestry of minorities. That's why the European Charter, which was actually accepted by the Ukraine in 2004, is so important. We will remember that Catalonia nearly went into a civil war against the central government in Madrid in Spain. And a decade earlier, the Basque people with their capital city of Bilbao. Let us just imagine the central government in Madrid had decided to deploy heavy artillery against civilian infrastructure and civilians in Bilbao or in Barcelona, killing thousands. And that is what happened since 2014, when teaching in the Russian language was forbidden, when practice in a Russian-speaking Christian church was made difficult and then forbidden. And basically all fundamental rights that we cherish in South Africa were suspended in the Ukraine, including elections. There have been no elections. So we need to understand that Russia will not just leave things as they are and carry on having a neighbor that is belligerent and is infusing hatred against Russian people in the Ukraine and outside the Ukraine. That has to end, and that is making these negotiations very difficult. Again, I think South Africa, from its own experience of tolerance and inclusion, could possibly lead to an acceptance that the modern statehood is not a statehood of uniform power, of extreme nationalism, of oppression. That is unacceptable to South Africa. It should be unacceptable to the European Union and to those countries that are calling for more war and are plowing more weapons and a lot more money into the conflict.
Well, according to reports, I mean, the United States is trying to broker a deal which would include Ukraine dropping its ambition to join NATO, something that up until now Ukraine hasn't been able to drop. How could a Cyril Ramaphosa, you know, it goes back to where we started. Can a Cyril Ramaphosa convince a President Zelensky to do that, which the Americans failed to convince him to do, or at least up until now?
Well, he could walk in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela and alert President Zelensky that he is about to step into an abyss. Because if this conflict continues, most observers have absolutely no doubt that militarily Russia would prevail and win. And that would mean a very terrible ending for Zelensky and his government. So to understand reality is the first step to overcome a conflict, to understand that the hopes that one brings into a conflict may not materialize. South Africa understood that they could have chosen to, for instance, try and chase all white people, all former oppressors out of the country, all 6 million, and cause a unbelievable humanitarian disaster and tragedy. But South Africa didn't do it. It came at a price, and it offended many people's pride and desires also for revenge. But I think South Africa became a much better place because reason prevailed over emotion, over pride, over sentiments of nationalism. And let us hope that South Africa can, beyond the good example and beyond the encouraging words, also offer something in terms of cooperation, agricultural cooperation, and a road for the Ukraine back into Africa, because in Africa the Ukraine is completely isolated, and it is to its detriment, because Ukraine could trade many things with Africa and benefit from it, and also, instead of being inward looking, start looking outward into a continent that is a continent of the future. So let us hope that the conversations go well. There's a lot of psychological issues at stake. People need to find the right temperature. They need to find the emotional framework that makes it possible to really listen to each other, to understand each other. It is, of course, something that shattered Europe and also parts of Ukraine, that there was a violation of a border. But people have closed their eyes to the 10 years that preceded the violation of the border by the Russian special operation. And those 10 years also cost about 12,000 lives, lives of very simple and normal people that were good Ukrainians. If they had wanted to be Russians, they would have all gone to live in Russia, but they didn't. They stayed in Ukraine, just like white people in South Africa feel South Africans. They stayed in South Africa. So to find a settlement, we'll need a new constitution, a new constitutional approach to how a multi-ethnic nation can live in peace.
Which then brings us to another, shall we say, bitter pill for President Zelensky to swallow, which is the other demand, reportedly, that Russia would want to retain territories that it, or at least part of territories that it occupies, including Crimea.
Definitely a bitter pill, but we live in lots of anachronisms in Europe. After the dissolution, the end of the Soviet Union, the military pact of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, was dissolved, but NATO was not dissolved. NATO, as the counterpart of the Warsaw Pact, should then have been replaced by a pan-European security system that could have included Russia and the Ukraine, and we wouldn't have this conflict now. But somehow NATO continued its expansionist view of the world. It moved eastward. Year after year, it installed more missile systems closer and closer to the Russian border. And obviously, these missile systems weren't programmed to possibly hit London or Paris. They were all programmed and pointed at St. Petersburg and Moscow and other big urban centers in Russia. And when it started happening to include the Ukraine, obviously a alarm bell rang, just like the Cuban crisis, when a much too aggressive Soviet Union decided to place missiles in Cuba that were pointing at major cities in North America. It nearly brought the world to World War III. So this was a folly. Most senior people have acknowledged that. President Trump is the first one to have, from a highest point of authority, acknowledged it and come to the conclusion this war need not have happened. Now that it has happened, I think it is the duty of all responsible heads of state to try and contribute to end it, so that not more lives will perish and not more destruction will happen in that part of the world.
Speaking of President Donald Trump and his administration, in what way do you believe, or ways, that the conversation that's bound to take place tomorrow between Presidents Zelensky and Ramaphosa could actually worsen the already frosty relations between South Africa and the United States?
It's difficult to look into the stars, but from an observer point of view, it is quite clear that the moment that the United States stopped funding important aid projects in South Africa and started imposing tariffs on very important products from this country, the European Union arrived and basically promised to help, but in return demanded an opening up of South Africa's international relations stance in favor of the Ukraine. I think this has resulted in this visit, and this is the risk that by possibly buying into the European Ukraine strategy, and I must say it's not just the European strategy, it is mainly a strategy driven by the UK, by France, and by Germany, by buying into that strategy, which is trying to contradict and break the American effort to achieve peace for the Ukraine now. It is in part driven by very selfish economic interests in Europe. The biggest ammunition manufacturer, Rheinmetall, which operates in joint venture with Denel here in South Africa, has seen their share value rise from 40 euros to over 1,200 euros a share over a period of 2 years. There are huge economic interests in continuing with this conflict, and that is very saddening because it has nothing to do with international peace and security. It has nothing to do with international law.
That said, though, Prof, I mean, the European influence you're talking about, that is. Do you think President Ramaphosa would have gone ahead with this without some form of tacit endorsement on the part of the Russian or the Russians, who in turn seem to be in fairly good books with the US administration?
Well, Russian-American relations were completely frozen to the point that there were no communication lines, but they have, over the last 2 to 3 months, they have resumed. There are communication lines. There is consideration in America to lift some of the sanctions against Russia. And America seems to accept Russia's point of view that the people living in the Crimea have, in a valid vote, in a valid consultation, opted to become part of the Russian Federation, and that this should be respected, possibly subject to further elections in the future. So America and Russia have reached a manner of resuming their original role since World War II, since the Conference of Yalta, of being the two powers that are mainly responsible for peace and security in the world. They will have to integrate China, because China definitely is a power of equal strength, and these are complex dynamics. We don't see in the small little perspective of South Africa much of a role for us to play, other than to encourage, other than to lead by example, to say it is possible to overcome enormous collective hatred. These conflicts arise from demonization of the other. Germany in World War II spoke of the Russians as a subhuman species. These things can be overcome, but let us hope that they do not get derailed by what I consider sinister interests that are transferring enormous fortunes, enormous capital and financial power and influence on the back of an arming and rearming effort, which currently in Europe is being budgeted with 500 billion euros, a staggering amount if we remember that we actually need that capital to combat global warming. Suddenly, everybody has forgotten the risk and the danger to humanity arriving from global warming, and instead we are arming. Instead, we are suddenly ranking up the production of nuclear weapons. This is a very dangerous slide, and I must say, although I'm not a fan of President Trump, personally, he is doing the right thing of stepping on the brake and talking to Russia and saying, let us hold a development that cannot serve any good interest in the world.
André Thomashausen, let me thank you very much for your time and insights this evening. Retired Professor of International Law at the University of South Africa, on the eve